The Chain Brides. The hidden story of 1,000,000 women marched in wedding gowns. A damp cobblestone street in an industrial city of Central Europe, spring of 1912. In a photograph captured by German war photographer Heinrich Wolff, hundreds of women in white wedding dresses, their hands chained together, are marching between two rows of mounted soldiers holding rifles. Melting spring snow has pooled on the street, reflecting pale, hollow faces. Above them, white petals, perhaps rose blossoms, perhaps grains of rice, fall gently, glimmering like snowflakes, creating the illusion of a royal wedding. But these brides are not walking toward an altar. No grooms await them ahead. They are being escorted under guard. We are drawn to this image by its cruel contradiction. The wedding dress, a symbol of love and free will, has been transformed into a prison uniform. The festive crowds lining the street, traditionally there to offer joyful blessings, now serve as a facade for a mass coercion. Why do people applaud and cheer even as they witness a chain gang? And more importantly, what history led to such a tragic spectacle, one that, a century later, has nearly vanished from our textbooks? What happened in the shadows? At the start of the 20th century, Europe was no longer the land of quaint villages and postcard landscapes. Cities were swelling by the day. Factory chimneys rose beside church steeples. The sound of bells drifted into the smoky air, lost, distant, and fading. And in the midst of this upheaval was a quiet revolution. Women were beginning to reshape their own destinies. These were women who had once been taught that their only purpose was to be wives and mothers. Now they held wrenches, operated looms, and typed on clattering typewriters. From the steel mills of the Ruhr to the garment workshops of Paris, women were suddenly everywhere, and it made many people uneasy. Not because women were weak, but because they were growing stronger than society allowed. This change was not welcomed. Lecture halls, town halls, and especially churches began warning of a decline in morals. It was true. More women were living alone, raising children on their own, or even rejecting marriage entirely. But instead of asking why these women made such choices, society rushed to label them as immoral, and in a systematic backlash, laws were created, not to protect women, but to force them back into their proper place. In Austria-Hungary, the 1911 Honor Protection Act declared that a woman could not leave her husband without a valid reason, but domestic violence was never considered valid. In Britain and Germany, moral reform acts legalized the confinement of women in reform centers if they were deemed a threat to public decency. The church didn't just approve. Some institutions ran these centers directly. Take the Magdalene Laundries, for example. Promoted as places of redemption for wayward women, they were in fact forced labor camps where women scrubbed laundry until their hands bled and prayed until their voices broke. All in the name of cleansing the soul. A world war was looming. And the men, first-class citizens, were preparing to take up arms. But who would supply them with bullets? Who would stitch their uniforms, pack their shells with gunpowder? The answer was found: women. And if they would not volunteer, then let forced marriage bind them to the system, marriage certificates becoming legalized chains. The forced wedding campaign. In 1911, in Silesia, a rapidly industrializing region of Central Europe, a special campaign was launched. On paper, it carried a name meant to evoke sympathy: reintegration of morally fallen women. But behind this humanitarian facade lay a meticulously organized system of coercion, coordinated by the police, the church, and the military. Who were the targets? Women sleeping on park benches, single mothers in shelters, young women discharged from hospitals with no husband waiting at the door. Living alone or wearing trousers instead of a skirt was often enough to be deemed morally suspicious. These women were arrested, without trial, without lawyers, and without the need for evidence. They were taken to moral education centers, which were, in reality, prisons. Their names were replaced by numbers, and then came the so-called wedding. These weddings had no love, no consent. White gowns were issued like uniforms. Rings were placed like handcuffs. Each bride was paired with a name, sometimes a factory worker, sometimes a soldier at the front, sometimes even with someone already dead. A public procession was arranged, not to celebrate, but to display. They paraded through the city center like a festive event, but in truth, it was a march of submission. Spectators were invited to watch, as if attending a play. Many cried, genuinely believing these women had been rescued. After the ceremony, the so-called honor brides were sent straight to the trains, their destinations, munitions factories, laundry camps, or gunpowder workshops. They worked from dawn until midnight, slept on cold floors, ate watery porridge. No rest days, no letters home. The propaganda was lively. Newspapers published photos of smiling brides beside white flowers. But the real images, hands bleeding from chains, eyes sunken from exhaustion, were carefully hidden. They called it honorary marriage, but it was a handcuff disguised as a wedding ring. Women speak through the silence. In locked rooms, surrounded by the scent of gunpowder and industrial soap, the only thing that remained were hurried, scribbled words. For many women, writing was the last way to hold on to a sliver of identity, a name, a voice, a question no one had yet answered. Sophia Lentz, 22 years old, was forced to marry a soldier she had never met. In a small notebook hidden beneath her straw mattress, she wrote, "I don't know who my husband is, but I know I've been sold. By a wedding, by a ring, by a piece of paper." Her words were short and cold, yet they spoke volumes. And she was not the only one who wrote. Anna Muller, a nurse who once worked in a retirement home, was arrested for living alone, wearing dresses above the knee, and skipping church. In a letter to her best friend, she wrote, "My wedding was a funeral without a casket, and no one came to mourn." Many women were separated from their newborns. Some were forced to sign over their babies to orphanages immediately after giving birth, never allowed to ask for a name or keep any keepsake. Others were sterilized without consent. Society must not reproduce broken souls, officials would say. These women had no lawyers, no right to object, no one to defend them. They lived and died inside a system designed to control, punish, and erase. Most were poor, immigrants, or widows of war, people with no home to return to, no one to speak for them. Life inside the camps was a slow unraveling. The daily routine was military-like. The food was laced with chemicals. Sleep was sacrificed to endless night shifts. Even illness wasn't an excuse to stop working. Complaining was labeled as defiance. A few tried to escape. Some risked everything to tuck letters into shipment boxes, hoping someone out there might hear them. But most were caught and punished in front of the entire camp. Some were even forced into another marriage afterward, as if their previous suffering hadn't gone deep enough. In a system built on ideals of morality, their voices were the only thing that could not be fully silenced. Fragile as they were, scrawled on yellowing paper, still defiant in the dark. History's silence. As the smoke of World War I began to clear, not everyone was eager to look back at what had happened. The moral crisis was buried beneath the urgent need for stability. What had once been created in the name of social reform was now something to be erased from collective memory. Authorities quickly ordered the destruction of all records related to the honorary weddings. Detention centers were quietly shut down. Lists of brides disappeared from official archives. The remaining letters were cut from reports. Churches cited sacred confidentiality to refuse access to baptism or marriage registries. The media shifted its tone. Articles that had once enthusiastically reported on these moving ceremonies began reframing the campaign as a humanitarian effort to help misguided women. No one spoke of chains, coercion, or forced labor. Photographs showing hands bound behind backs were removed from publication. Society, already used to viewing women through a lens of suspicion, easily accepted this edited version of events. When the women returned, they were not welcomed. Neighbors and even family looked at them with doubt. If she was taken away, she probably wasn't a decent woman. There were no apologies, no signs of remorse, no effort to restore their dignity. And so, many women chose silence. Some changed their names and left their hometowns. Others never told their children or grandchildren anything, out of shame, fear, or simply because no one wanted to listen. As a result, tens of thousands of women were deliberately erased from civic records. What remains are gaps in family trees, unnamed photographs, and unfinished stories passed down in fragments. It wasn't war that killed them. It was society's decision to forget them. A cold, systematic forgetting that even now casts a shadow over the memory of an entire generation. Reviving memory, demanding justice. It wasn't until the 1970s, with the rise of the feminist movement, that old wounds were finally given a chance to be seen again. A group of young historians, many of them descendants of the victims, began searching for the truth. They sifted through old newspapers, uncovered erased names, and interviewed survivors. In 1978, at an exhibition in Berlin, the photograph titled "The Chained Brides" was revealed for the first time. The black and white image was blurry, yet unbearably clear. A line of brides in white dresses, their hands chained, their eyes hollow. The entire country was shaken. Helena Weber, 90 years old, saw the image and finally dared to speak. She recalled, "They called me a bride, but I was a prisoner. My marriage had no love, only silence. A few lawsuits were filed. Some churches were ordered to issue apologies and offer reparations, small sums that could never make up for stolen youth. Most of the perpetrators had already passed away. But the testimonies, the memories, and the courage, they lived on. Today, memorials stand in Warsaw and Vienna. Sculptures of faceless, nameless brides. Novels, documentaries, and illustrations have been created, not just to remember, but to remind. Because this truth does not rest quietly in history books. It echoes in modern-day forced marriages, in forced labor, in campaigns of moral reform carried out in the name of religion or nationalism, and that is why we must look it in the eye. Because not everyone in a wedding dress has chosen to wear it. Not everyone who stays silent deserves to be forgotten. And justice, even if it comes late, must still be named.